What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
What if I told you that everything you believed about me was a lie that someone else decided was convenient to spread? A story so simple and dirty that it stuck faster than anything I could ever do to clean it up. And what if I told you that the very people who should have known me best swallowed it whole and kicked me out without hesitation, leaving me to figure out whether I would sink or learn how to survive without them? That is where my story starts, and to this day I can still feel the sting of how quickly my so-called reputation collapsed the moment Brooke Mason opened her mouth. Brooke was not just some random girl. She was someone my family liked to keep around because she knew how to smile sweetly at church. She always helped carry food at family barbecues, and she had that fake charm that older people confuse for honesty. One day, she told my parents that I was easy and into dealing, and instead of even looking at me straight in the eye and asking what she meant or where she got such a disgusting idea, they looked at me as if they had been waiting for confirmation of something shameful. I remember my dad not yelling, not lecturing, just saying that I should pack my things and go because he would not have that kind of behavior under his roof. I stood there stunned because I thought at least my mom would step in, but she didn't. My brother Kyle avoided eye contact altogether, which I later realized was because he had been seeing Brooke behind my back. Being thrown out is not dramatic in the way movies make it look. It is not bags packed with sad music in the background. It is messy, humiliating, and deeply practical. You grab what you can, you leave things behind you know you will never see again, and you crash on couches where you are tolerated for a week until you feel like you are a burden. I got a front desk job at a low-end motel just so I could keep paying for some cheap food and eventually a small rented room. But when you have been labeled as that girl, the rumors follow because gossip does not have an expiration date. I would go to job interviews and feel people's eyes flicker with recognition, not from me, but from the garbage they had heard. That was when I learned the first real rule of surviving lies. Gossip moves fast, but paperwork moves slower, and paperwork wins in the end if you collect enough of it. I met Alicia Torres, who worked in HR at the motel chain, and she was the first person to treat me like a real adult with potential. She said, "Write everything down, make timelines, request copies of anything that has your name on it, and never rely on people's memory because they will twist it." So I started a file. Dates, screenshots, emails, anything that could show who said what and when. I remember getting a weird pharmacy text one night that said my prescription was ready. The thing is, I had no prescription. I thought maybe it was spam, but Alicia told me to keep it because sometimes a mistake is proof. Years later that text would matter, but back then it just felt like one more glitch in a broken system. My first small act of revenge was boring on the surface, but satisfying in its own way. I discovered that Brooke had been using my name in random online groups to spread little hints, posting things like, "Ask Hannah, she knows where to get it." I quietly reported those posts to moderators with nothing dramatic, just factual references to their own platform's defamation policies. The posts disappeared. No arguments, no messy fights, just gone. She lost her stage, and I got one tiny square of ground back. At the same time, I started freezing anything that even smelled like an account opened in my name. Credit card applications, discount cards, weird apps that wanted bank links, locked down. I filed fraud alerts with the credit bureaus. I was not powerful yet, but I was making it harder for Brooke to breathe freely. Every time I closed a door she had been sneaking through, I wrote it down. I was not going to argue with her or beg my parents. I was going to build a record so thick that eventually no one could deny it. The cliffhanger that first made me realize just how far she was willing to go came from an old Venmo screenshot I stumbled across when a friend mentioned her cousin had paid me once. I said, "I never got money from your cousin." She pulled up the old record, and there it was, my name in the memo line, with the words, "Study supplies." It made my stomach drop because it was not just rumor anymore, it was paper, it was money, and it was directly tied to me in a way I had never authorized. That was when I knew Brooke was not just whispering trash, she was planting evidence. And that was when I promised myself, I am not letting this breathe, not 1 second longer. Holidays have a way of testing what is real and what is just for show, because when November rolls around and everyone starts asking about plans and traditions and favorite pies, You realize very quickly who has a place to go and who pretends that working a double shift is a choice, and that year I leaned hard into the story that I liked the quiet and the overtime because it paid time and a half. Even though the truth was that my family had stopped calling and I was not invited to the table where my chair used to be, which is the sort of thing that sounds dramatic until you live it and see how absurdly practical it becomes to buy a microwave dinner and tell yourself you prefer it that way. I learned to navigate the social fallout with a kind of blunt honesty that made people pause before they gossiped, because if someone tried to slide a hint into conversation about me being wild or careless, I would respond with a calm list of facts that left no air in the room for speculation, and while that sounds cold, it actually kept me sane, since I did not have the luxury of being vague anymore. One recruiter tried to reject me with a polite line about culture fit, and I told her I understood, then sent a clean timeline of my work history with references who answer calls and a brief note about a false rumor that I was actively addressing through proper channels, and by the end of the week, she called back and said the offer still stood if I wanted it, which I did because I had rent to pay and a future to build. At church, the optics were almost funny if you squinted, because the same people who thought of me as a problem loved Brooke for how quickly she signed up to bring cupcakes to every event. And yet when a small fundraiser came up light by an amount that made the treasurer nervous, it was the pastor's wife, Carla, who pulled me aside in the parking lot and admitted, with that tired half-smile people get when they are done pretending, that the money routines were sloppy and that she could use a hand creating simple controls, so we never had to guess again where the cash went after the jars were counted. And I told her I could help with something basic like two-person counts, written logs, and a rule that every reimbursement needs a receipt. Not because I wanted to play cop, but because I had learned the hard way that loose processes invite people like Brooke to become storytellers with props. The second small revenge started there, in a folding chair at a midweek committee meeting where no one expects fireworks and everyone expects women to be nice, because instead of giving speeches about integrity, I typed up a one-page policy and handed it to Carla and the team, and the moment those lines got adopted, the charm game that Brooke played at church hit a wall, since the new way of doing things did not care how sweet your voice sounded if the numbers did not add up. And I will admit that watching her smile tighten when the treasurer asked for receipts was better than pie, because it was not cruelty, it was accountability, and it did not have my name on it, it had standards. Meanwhile at work I did something similar but more personal. I built a reputation with my new manager for being predictable in the best way, which means I returned calls when I said I would, I documented decisions, and I kept a shared folder with project notes so that no one had to guess what I was doing, and that rhythm slowly shifted how people approached me, since once you look like a person who has receipts for everything, the casual rumor machine starts to grind and squeal and eventually spit bolts because it cannot run on fuel that old, and while that did not reverse the past, it began to dry up opportunities for Brooke to drop new poison into fresh circles. Socially it still hurt, I am not going to pretend otherwise, because when Christmas came and my mom posted a family photo with a caption about being grateful for everyone under one roof, I stared too long at the screen and decided that my dignity mattered more than any comment I could leave, so I put the phone down, took a breath, and scheduled a lunch for the next day with Alicia, who listened to me rant for a solid hour, and then said something simple that rerouted my mood, which was that people who trade in gossip need reactions to feel powerful, but people who trade in records only need time, and time is finally on our side, and as obvious as that sounds, it helped, because it reminded me that I was not just surviving. I was slowly building leverage. The real turning point in this episode, the one where my stomach fell and my mind clicked into a higher gear, came when a detail from the weird pharmacy text years earlier resurfaced through a friend who worked as a tech and explained, in the kind of plain language that makes you stop breathing for a second, that most pharmacies keep pickup logs linked to names and dates, sometimes with notes about who said they were picking up for whom, and when she looked at entries tied to my name, because I asked, she found pickups that did not match my location or my schedule, including one afternoon when I had clocked a double shift on the other side of town and could prove it, and the note on the pickup said something like, grabbing for a friend. followed by a smiley face doodle the cashier must have added, which sounds harmless until you realize someone was stepping into pharmacies with my name on their lips and a friendly tone in their voice, and that is not gossip, that is a footprint. I stood there with the phone warm in my hand and felt that familiar mix of anger and focus, because while it hurt to be copied and used, it also meant I had a trail that belonged to me, not to rumor, and that trail could be requested, printed, verified, and filed, which is exactly what I did next. I requested the logs through the proper process. I matched dates against my timesheets, and I added every line to the growing folder that had become my shield and my sword, and then, in a move that may sound petty but was strategic, I cut off Brooke's favorite path into my life by locking down every form of casual access. No shared accounts, no family plan excuses, no digital doors she could crack with a smile. And each time I closed one more entry point, I imagined the look on her face when the easy route dried up, and she had to consider that I was not playing defense anymore, I was building a case. And, just when I thought I had taken the air out of the room, my phone buzzed with a message from a mutual acquaintance saying Brooke had heard I was digging, and that it looked obsessive, which would have made me laugh if it were not so familiar. Because when people who live by gossip feel the edge of a real record, they call you dramatic to keep you small, but I was done being small, which is why I told the acquaintance to pass along a simple sentence to Brooke that I preferred paperwork to drama and that I hoped she kept good records, because I certainly did, and as I hit send, the thought formed in a way that felt solid enough to stand on. Once the logs arrived in my hand, this would no longer be about surviving the holidays or dodging whispered remarks in fellowship halls. It would be about aligning every provable fact under my name and pushing, without yelling, until the people who threw me out had to look at what they believed and explain, out loud, how they got there. When the pharmacy logs landed in my hands, stamped with dates, initials, and notations that could not be erased with a sweet smile or a dismissive shrug, I finally understood what Alicia had meant all along when she told me that paperwork, no matter how boring or delayed, eventually crushes gossip if you have the patience to keep stacking it, because every page was a nail in the coffin of Brooke's favorite story, and instead of just knowing I was being smeared, I now had evidence that she had been walking into pharmacies with my name, claiming to be me, and picking up prescriptions I never needed, which meant that the narrative about me being into dealing had never been a careless rumor at all, but a carefully seeded campaign with fake receipts. And the realization that someone I had once eaten lunch with could go that far was infuriating, but it was also liberating, because now the game had changed. I sat down with Alicia and spread the papers across her kitchen table, and she walked me through the steps like a teacher explaining long division, telling me to file an identity misuse report without once using Brooke's name. Because this was not about personal revenge in the eyes of the law, but about creating a clean paper trail that could later be tied to whoever it needed to be tied to, and she was right, because while I wanted to scream Brooke's name from the rooftops, I knew better than to give her the drama she thrived on. So instead I filed quietly, listing dates, pickup logs, and my own timesheets that proved I had been working elsewhere, and then I folded the confirmation slip into my ever-thickening file and felt, for the first time, like I was finally on offense instead of defense. Around the same time, Carla's quiet audit of church funds started to ripple through the community, and while it never exploded into the scandal I might have fantasized about, it was enough to make people stop and ask simple questions that never used to be asked, such as where receipts were, who approved reimbursements, and why certain events seemed to consistently come up late. And although no one shouted Brooke's name in the sanctuary, everyone noticed that she stepped down from a committee role to focus on family, which was polite language for too many red flags, and while some people still clung to her version of charm, the cracks were now visible. The next blow came from closer to home, and it hit harder than anything the church or the pharmacy could have delivered, because one evening when I was scrolling through social media, I saw the announcement photo of my brother Carl holding Brooke's hand with a cheap diamond ring sparkling under the caption, "She said yes," and I realized in that moment why he had never defended me, why he had avoided my eyes the night I was kicked out, and why he had stayed silent for years, because he had chosen his loyalty, and it was not with his sister, but with the girl who had detonated her reputation, and while the betrayal stung, it also clarified something in me. Because I knew then that this was no longer a sibling misunderstanding or a family rift that could be patched with time. It was an alliance, and alliances could be fought strategically. I did not rage on his post or leave sarcastic comments, because I knew that was what Brooke would have expected me to do, a messy, emotional response she could screenshot and pass around. So instead, I wrote a one-page letter to my parents and my brother, listing dates, documents, and actions taken, with a short conclusion that said, "This is what happened, this is what I filed, and this is what I will accept as a correction when you are ready," and then I mailed it with delivery confirmation so no one could claim it was lost, and that letter was not just information, it was a line in the sand that said the door was closed until truth walked in first. A week later, I received a text from an unknown number that said, "Let it go or you'll look obsessed," which had Brooke's fingerprints all over it even if her name was not attached, and while for a second I felt the heat of anger rise up in my chest, within minutes I was laughing, because obsession is exactly what people call you when you refuse to let their lies stand unchallenged, and the more they beg you to drop it, the more you know you are striking at the weak spot they cannot reinforce. So I screenshot it, filed it, and moved on. But just as I was starting to feel steady in my position, an automated email arrived from a background check company used by employers, asking me to verify details about a supposed disciplinary action that had been reported under my name. And in that moment I felt my stomach twist, because this was not some playground rumor or casual whisper in a small town. This was an attack designed to sabotage my livelihood at the professional level, and while I managed to clear it quickly by providing the company with official HR statements from my current job, the fact that someone was feeding my name into these systems was a chilling reminder that the stakes had escalated from gossip in a church hallway to threats against my career. And that meant my counterstrike would have to be sharper, cleaner, and impossible to spin. That night, staring at the background check email and the stack of pharmacy logs, I understood with clarity that gossip is not harmless when it is tied to paperwork and systems, because it does not just bruise your reputation. It can strangle your opportunities, deny you housing, and block promotions, and that was when I decided that my file would not just be a personal shield, but a weapon I would use when the timing was right, because while Brooke thought she was burying me under stories, what she had really done was hand me every piece of evidence I needed to show the world who had been lying, and the day to reveal it was coming sooner than anyone in my family could imagine. Climbing the corporate ladder was never some dream I carried in childhood. It was simply the only available path that allowed me to prove, mostly to myself, but also to anyone watching closely enough, that the rumors which had once burned through my life were not destiny, but obstacles that could be beaten one documented victory at a time. And so when my department stumbled into a supply chain mess that had already swallowed 2 managers before me, I did not waste energy trying to be liked or soften my tone for comfort. I simply mapped the process, tracked the leaks, and fixed what others were too distracted or afraid to face. And when the system finally stabilized and the savings were visible on a spreadsheet that even the board could understand, the promotion that followed was not handed to me as a favor, but earned with sweat, persistence, and a refusal to let anyone else define what I was capable of. When Mr. Donovan called me into his office and told me I was being named operations lead, he added almost casually that he had also submitted my name for a local business magazine profile about people who quietly fix things. And while I smiled politely, inside I felt something shift, because that profile meant exposure, and exposure meant questions about family and background, the very areas I had spent years shielding from casual view. But instead of shrinking back, I decided to confront the topic head-on, and when the reporter sat across from me with her recorder and asked the predictable line about whether I credited my success to family support, I gave her an answer that was neither bitter nor emotional, but carefully designed to set the tone. "We are not in the same room until truth is in the room," I said, and then I handed her a copy of the timeline I had written months earlier, explaining that if my family wanted to comment, she could call the number on the page, but until they corrected the lie, that door was closed. It was not an angry declaration, but a professional boundary, and it worked, because the reporter looked at me with respect rather than pity, sensing the weight of a story, but also the strength of a woman who refused to grovel. And while part of me knew she would not be able to resist the drama of that quote, another part of me understood that it framed the entire narrative in my terms, not Brooke's, not my parents', not even Kyle's, because for the first time the words in print would not describe me as damaged or difficult, but as someone who had learned to demand truth as the price of access. That was also the moment I decided to create something symbolic, something that would both honor the pain I had lived through and redirect it into a constructive force that nobody could twist against me. And so I funded a modest scholarship in my mother's maiden name, a quiet program for girls who had lost family support while still in school, and the only application requirement was a verified copy of their records along with a short personal statement about what rumor had taken from them. Because I wanted those girls to understand early what it had taken me years to learn, that lies are not proof, paperwork is, and that when you can document your truth, you can eventually bend even the most stubborn narrative back into alignment. Watching the first applications trickle in gave me a strange sense of peace, because it reminded me that even if Brooke had poisoned my reputation within my own family, she had not destroyed my ability to define meaning for myself, and in fact, her attempt to smear me had given me the raw determination to build something larger than personal vindication, and while I did not fool myself into thinking my parents would be impressed, I did think maybe, just maybe, they might pause to consider that. The daughter they had cast aside had not collapsed, but risen in a way that demanded recognition. That illusion of peace shattered in the most predictable yet still gut-wrenching way possible on the very day of my promotion party, because just as the catering team was setting out trays and the first guests were walking through the door, my phone buzzed with a message from my father, a short line that said, "Please let us come inside," followed by another that added, "Your mother is with me," and I stood there with the device in my hand, staring at the words, torn between the child who once longed desperately to be invited back and the woman who now understood that unconditional access was over, because access without truth was just another form of control. I did not answer right away, because I wanted to let the tension sit, not just for them but for myself, and while people mingled and music played, I paced the hallway, replaying every memory of being dismissed without a hearing, of my brother's silence, of Brooke's smirk, and of the lonely holidays spent explaining to coworkers that I preferred overtime, and as those images layered on top of one another, the clarity I had been building for years returned to me like a steel rod in my spine. Because I realized the text was not a request, it was a test, and how I answered would set the stage for the rest of my life. The temptation to swing the door open and let them in as if nothing had happened was real, but so was the knowledge that doing so would erase everything I had built, all the careful records, all the quiet acts of revenge, all the boundaries I had set. And so instead of replying with an emotional outburst, I typed one clean line: "I will open the door when the lie is corrected," with full names, nothing less, and then I put the phone face down on the table and returned to my guests, because I wanted them to see me not as a woman begging her family for crumbs, but as a leader celebrating a promotion earned against the odds. That night, while the party continued, I knew with certainty that the story was moving toward a conclusion, and that the correction I had demanded was no longer a fantasy, but an inevitable next step. Because the simple fact that my father had texted meant the silence had cracked, and cracks, once formed, cannot be resealed without leaving evidence, and I promised myself that when the door finally opened, it would be on my terms, under my conditions, and with truth front and center, because anything else would not just be a loss, it would be betrayal repeated. I had promised myself that I would never again negotiate my worth in a hallway while guests milled around and small talk filled the air like static. So when my father's message blinked on my screen during the promotion party and my hands wanted to shake from the collision of past and present, I breathed slow, reminded myself that my leverage had been built line by line over years of patient record-keeping and boundary setting, and typed the single condition that mattered, which was that the door would open only when the lie was corrected with full names, on the record and without soft phrasing, because I would not reward anyone for choosing comfort over truth, and I sent the message knowing it would either land like a lifeline or like a wall. but either way it would be honest and final. The minutes that followed felt stretched and oddly quiet, even though the room around me was alive, because once you draw a line like that, you cannot pace or hover or try to manage how people will respond. You simply have to live the role you wrote. So I tucked the phone in my pocket, thanked the team who had carried impossible projects with me, raised a glass with Mr. Donovan, who said he had never seen a turnaround that clean in so little time, and laughed with colleagues who had no idea that a years-long family war was playing out one floor below. And when the phone finally buzzed again, I excused myself from a conversation about the magazine feature and stepped into a side office where the music dulled and the truth waited. My father had replied with a short acknowledgement that read like a man testing the edges of a fence he never expected to see, followed by a second message asking what words would be acceptable, which was both irritating and encouraging, because it proved he understood that this was not a plea for reunion, but a request for exact language, not the usual half-apology families barter with when they want holidays back without owning the damage, and I told him they could use the sentence I had mailed months earlier in the letter none of them had ever answered, then added that there were 3 steps and they were simple. The correction needed to be posted in our family thread exactly as written. The letter I had sent required their signatures and would be photographed for my files, and the sentence had to be said out loud, on camera, so that I would never again have to relive this argument with anyone who preferred memory to evidence. And as I hit send, I felt my heart climb into my throat. Not from fear, but from the steady knowledge that the door would stay shut if the steps were not met, no matter how loudly the past pounded. They arrived in the lobby together in a cluster that would have broken me a few years ago, my father holding the phone like an object that might bite, my mother tight-lipped but present, my brother caught between defiance and fatigue, and Brooke with that bright, practiced smile that used to con older church ladies into handing her committee keys, and I walked out with Alicia beside me, because I wanted a witness who would not be swayed by tears or sudden rewrites, and I greeted them calmly. Without reaching for a hug, then repeated the steps in the same voice I would use for any professional requirement, because I needed them to feel that this was not a performance, but a boundary that would not bend. And when Brooke tried to jump in with a suggestion that we use a lighter phrasing that focused on misunderstandings instead of lies, I cut her off with a simple no, pointed at the printed page, and said that the only path inside was the sentence as written, the signatures as requested, and the statement on camera without spin. My father surprised me by being the first to move, perhaps because men who like to call themselves decisive hate the feeling of being cornered by their own cowardice, and he opened the family thread, typed slowly, then read out loud as he tapped the words in, that Brooke Mason had started a false story about me, that the family chose to believe it without asking for proof, that I had never been easy or into dealing, and that the harm was real and on them, not on me. And while his voice caught once, he did not stop, and when he finished he held the phone for my mother like a man offering water, and she signed the letter with a hand that shook enough to force 2 attempts, then looked up at me with eyes that wanted reassurance I was not ready to give. And I nodded once, the way you nod when someone pays a past-due bill without asking for a discount. Kyle read the sentence without stumbling, which told me he had rehearsed it in his head or perhaps in his conscience, and when he finished he added a quiet line that was not on the page about choosing badly and staying quiet too long. And even though it was not required, I let it stand, because voluntary honesty counts for something even when it shows up late. But the moment hung on Brooke, who, faced with a wall she could not charm, tried one last pivot by claiming that she had never meant for things to go so far, and that this was all a misunderstanding that social media had twisted out of shape, and, while the old me might have fallen for the soft lighting of that excuse, this version of me simply held up the pharmacy logs and the background check request and the Venmo memo and said, clearly and without heat, that misunderstandings do not walk into pharmacies with other people's names, do not seed false memos, and do not submit fabricated disciplinary rumors to employment systems. And if she wanted to dispute any of it, she was welcome to produce her own documents right now. She stared at me with that fixed smile that finally looked like a mask too tight for the face it covered, said she would not be signing anything that slandered her, and turned toward the door with a threat about how I would regret making enemies. And as she walked out, the strangest calm rolled through me, not triumph at her exit, but relief that the decision had been made by facts and conditions, not by my appetite for family warmth. And I turned to the three people who remained and told them they could come inside now that the correction was posted and the letter was signed, but that the camera statement still mattered. And my father nodded, pressed record on my phone, and said the sentence again, this time in full view of a lens that does not forget. I will tell you something that may sound cold, but is actually the kindest truth I can give. I did not hug them right away, because affection without accountability is just a reset button for people who like to pretend the past dissolves when music starts. So I led them upstairs, let them take plates, and told them they could enjoy the night like everyone else. And while they greeted my coworkers and smiled for a photo that would be attached to a magazine piece already in motion, I excused myself to the hallway where the reporter waited with an envelope I had given her earlier, the one labeled to run only if a correction was made, and inside was a short paragraph that honored my parents for choosing truth despite the cost. Because I wanted the public story to reflect what I demand in private, which is that people can be wrong for a long time and still do the right thing when the bill comes due. Weeks later, when the feature ran with a single line about the scholarship and a respectful nod to the boundary I had set with my family, my phone lit up with messages from women and men who said they had swallowed lies about themselves for years and were now, finally, ready to collect records, write letters, and attach conditions to access. And in the quiet after the notifications cooled, a new text arrived from my brother that simply said he was done lying and that the wedding was off, and I stared at it for a long moment before putting the phone face down again, because not every message needs an immediate response, not every reconciliation has to be rushed, and not every victory looks like a bow tied in a perfect knot. Yet as I stood in my apartment with the door locked and the file finally closed, I knew that the final move had landed exactly as intended, which is to say that I had won without trading my dignity for a seat at a table that once asked me to leave. And that from now on, anyone who wanted to come inside would know the price with certainty, because the price was the truth, spoken out loud, recorded once, and never again up for debate.